Hi everyone, welcome to another video from KinestheticKnowledge. I'm Mahnoor, and today's video will focus on a little bit of research I did during the semester around labor and delivery, and then the impact that different delivery methods have on fascia, as well as some of my interesting connections that I found to fascia, pregnancy, and breathing. So for the first part of this video, I'm actually going to be presenting findings from this really interesting study that I read, and it was conducted by Fan et al. And what they did was that they investigated the impact of different delivery methods on abdominal muscles and fascia, and then they looked at that and the implications that had on postpartum health. So then to orient ourselves, actually, I'll first start by defining what C-section delivery is versus vaginal delivery. So C-section or cesarean delivery is when the baby is usually delivered through an incision in the abdomen of the mother and then through the uterus. So you actually go through many different layers, and when you go through those layers, you actually go through the layers of fascia as well. Whereas in vaginal delivery, the baby is usually born through the birth canal. So that's relatively not simple, but a well understood process. Then there are some other things that can actually differ the type of labor progress you go through, and that can actually be your recovery time as well as pain levels, etc. So, as many of you know, actually, cesarean section rates are actually increasing globally, and that's one of the reasons why the researchers were actually doing this study in general. And that's because C-sections, they actually impact postpartum health significantly. And then, so the research article then delved deeper into the topic, and they did this by comparing abdominal muscles and fascia in women who experienced transverse C-sections in comparison to vaginal delivery. And then they did this by also looking at those who were nulliparous, meaning that they had never been pregnant in their life. And what they really wanted to understand was how different delivery modes are impacting abdominal structures and how that correlates with postpartum pain. And so they recruited patients from different groups, and they utilized ultrasound evaluations to assess the thickness of abdominal muscles and fascia. And then they also recorded pain intensity, duration, location postpartum through a questionnaire to get more insights. And I think that some of their findings were really interesting. And one thing that they actually found was that when they were examining the muscular morphometry, in women who had C-sections, they actually observed a thinner left rectus abdominis compared to those who had never been pregnant before. And then similarly in those who had a vaginal delivery, the RA was thinner bilaterally compared to, again, those who had never been pregnant. And then they also found that in C-section women, they exhibited a thicker right internal oblique compared to vaginal delivery. And then this kind of just really oriented my understanding as to how different delivery methods do specifically impact. I mean, it sounds really obvious, of course, but it's much more interesting to read about it in an actual study to see that there was significant differences seen. And then they actually then looked into fascial morphometry. This is what was really interesting to me. So they actually discovered that in C-section women, they actually had a wider interrectus distance and a thicker rectus sheath. So that's really interesting, like the aponeurotic sheath of that. And then they also had a thicker abdominal perimuscular fascia. And this was compared to those who had never been pregnant. And then to me, this is really interesting also because when you see these differences in fascial thickness, it leads you to realize that it does have a significant implication on postpartum recovery because there might be a lot of pain involved there, and surgical surgical recovery for fascia is very hard and it's very different. And then that also then has an impact because it is your abdomen on abdominal stability. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think this is also just really highlighted the complexity between these different delivery modes, and how, you know, it looks different for everybody, but there are certain connections that can be made. So that was really interesting. Now I'm just going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the research that I was able to find on how breathing and how that is impacted during pregnancy and how that can actually impact your fascia as well. And so just to orient ourselves, breathing is a reflex mechanism that happens, and it actually affects a lot of, and it is impacted by, our emotional states as well as pain. And so we might breathe faster or we might breathe slower. And then when you have musculoskeletal dysfunctions, that can, for example, when you have alterations of your trunk muscles, that actually affects breathing behavior as well. And then the biggest connection that you can actually find is that obviously, breathing patterns significantly impact carbon dioxide levels in the body. So when you overbreathe, your ventilation is exceeding metabolic demands, and that can actually lead to hypocapnia, which is characterized by CO2 levels that are below the normal range. And hypocapnia is actually very common in pregnancy. And so symptoms of these can look like paresthesis and muscle cramping. And sometimes this is not often detected because they can actually overlap with other common complaints during pregnancy. And then so when we are considering hypocapnia that can actually happen when you are pregnant, you have changes in the pH of the body because the fluids become more alkaline, they cause decreased tissue oxygenation, and they actually also do constriction of smooth muscles. And this could be in the vessels, in the gut, in the bronchi. And then these changes actually lead to symptoms in many body systems that can then have an effect on the fascia related to these body systems. So, for example, some of the visceral fascia covering your organs, and then in context of breathing, that would be your lungs actually. And then some of the research that I looked into, it actually did find that because there appears to be smooth muscle in the form of myofibroblasts in fascia, it is actually likely that fascial smooth muscle would also really constrict. It would also respond similarly for those who might have hypocapnia when they're pregnant. But I think what's really important to highlight in general research as well is how hypocapnia during pregnancy can serve as an adaptive mechanism, right? Because when you have this alkaline state induced, it can facilitate the contraction of your abdominal fascia. And then when you have this contraction, it can actually counteract the effects of increasing abdominal size, and then as well as tissue softening, which happen usually because of pregnancy-related hormones. And then lastly, one thing that I want to share that I found in research was how, because when you have hypocapnia, you are in an alkalotic state, the body's response is to change because they have decreased hydrogen concentration. And so then what the body does is that it's going to mine the intracellular fluids for hydrogen ions. So this would be sodium and potassium ions. And then what happens is that these ions that are in the extracellular fluid are exchanged with hydrogen ions in the cell. And then this means that you have an alteration in the chemistry of the extracellular fluid. When you have changes in the extracellular fluid chemistry, you are actually changing the ground substance of fascia. So then that has an impact on wherever that fascia may be, whether that's on an organ, whether that's on a parietal cavity, etc. And so the reason why this was such an interesting finding to me and interesting research to me was how there's interplay between breathing patterns, between CO2 regulations, as well as your fascial physiology, and how that really does impact a lot of pregnancy-related symptoms. And then in turn, that's going to impact musculoskeletal health. And then, of course, when we consider breathing patterns and we consider the fascial makeup, we can then also consider how that is in relation to different labor and delivery methods. So thank you so much for paying attention and listening in on this other episode of Kinesthetic Knowledge that focused on my findings of research with regards to fascia, pregnancy, and breathing.